In September of 2018, 32-year-old botanist Rebecca Hartwell disappeared during a solo research expedition in the Bridger-Teton National Forest of northwestern Wyoming. She had been documenting the effects of pine beetle infestation on lodgepole pine populations, work that was part of her doctoral thesis at the University of Montana. On September 14th, Rebecca checked in with the ranger station at Turpin Meadow, filing a backcountry permit for a 5-day trip into a remote section of the forest near the Teton Wilderness boundary. The ranger on duty, Carl Morrison, later recalled that she seemed well prepared and confident, carrying professional-grade equipment and enough supplies for her planned duration, plus 3 extra days as a safety margin. Her research required her to visit specific GPS coordinates where she had established monitoring sites the previous summer. The locations were spread across approximately 15 square miles of dense forest, connected by game trails and old logging roads that barely qualified as paths. Rebecca was an experienced outdoors woman who had spent years conducting fieldwork in remote locations. She carried a satellite phone, a personal locator beacon, and had established a communication schedule with her advisor, Dr. Martin Chen, who expected to hear from her every evening at 6. The first 2 days proceeded according to plan. Rebecca called at the designated times, reporting her progress, describing the data she was collecting, and confirming her position. Her voice was cheerful, professional, entirely normal. On the evening of September 16th, the call did not come. Dr. Chen waited an hour, then tried calling her satellite phone. It went directly to an automated message indicating the device was either turned off or out of coverage area, which should not have been possible given the satellite network's capabilities. He called again every hour through the night, growing increasingly concerned. By dawn of September 17th, he contacted the Teton County Search and Rescue. The initial response was swift and thorough. A helicopter was dispatched at first light, flying over Rebecca's last known position in the areas she had planned to visit. Spotters looked for any sign of her tent, her bright red backpack, or the orange equipment cases she used for her instruments. They saw nothing but an endless carpet of green pine forest, broken occasionally by meadows and streams. Ground teams mobilized by midday. Experienced searchers, many of them volunteers who knew the Bridger-Teton intimately, spread out in grid patterns from Rebecca's last confirmed GPS position. They called her name, listened for whistle signals, looked for any trace of human passage through the undergrowth. The forest was dense here, thick with lodgepole pine and subalpine fir, the ground carpeted with pine needles that showed footprints poorly. Game trails crisscrossed the area in confusing patterns. It would be easy to become disoriented, though Rebecca's GPS should have prevented that. Search dogs were brought in on the second day. They picked up a scent trail leading north from one of Rebecca's monitoring sites, following it for nearly a mile before losing it completely at the edge of a rocky outcrop. The handlers tried multiple times to reacquire the trail, but it was as if Rebecca had simply vanished at that point. No trace of her continued in any direction. The search expanded over the following week. More than 100 people combed through the forest. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew patterns over the area, looking for heat signatures. Divers checked lakes and rivers, though there were no bodies of water directly along Rebecca's planned route. Every abandoned structure within a 10-mile radius was searched. Every mine shaft, every cave, every potential shelter was investigated. They found nothing. Rebecca's family arrived from Colorado, her parents and younger sister joining the command post that had been established at Turpin Meadow. Her father, Robert Hartwell, a retired civil engineer, studied topographic maps obsessively, trying to understand where his daughter might have gone. Her mother, Janet, distributed flyers with Rebecca's photograph to every business, every trailhead, every campground within 50 miles. Her sister, Emma, organized volunteers, coordinated social media campaigns, and refused to accept the possibility that Rebecca might not be found. But as September turned to October and the first snows began to dust the high peaks, the active search was gradually scaled back. The official statement from Teton County Search and Rescue cited the vast area involved, the difficult terrain, and the lack of any concrete leads. They emphasized that the case remained open, that they would respond immediately to any new information. But the reality was clear. Rebecca Hartwell had disappeared into the wilderness as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The investigation into Rebecca Hartwell's disappearance continued in a reduced capacity through the winter of 2018 and into 2019. Detective Sarah Blackwood of the Teton County Sheriff's Office took over the case, reviewing every piece of evidence, every statement, every timeline. She found nothing that suggested anything other than a tragic accident in unforgiving wilderness. Rebecca's personal life was examined thoroughly. Her finances were stable, her relationships healthy, her career progressing well. She had no reason to disappear voluntarily and every reason to complete her research and return home. Her satellite phone was never activated again. Her credit cards and bank accounts showed no activity after the day she vanished. Her vehicle, a Subaru Outback, remained parked at the ranger station where she had left it, slowly accumulating dust and pine needles. The mystery drew attention from amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts. Theories proliferated online. Some suggested Rebecca had been attacked by a grizzly bear, though no evidence of this was ever found, and bear attacks in the area were rare. Others proposed that she had fallen into a hidden ravine or crevasse, but the search had covered such features extensively. More elaborate theories involved abduction by persons unknown, though the remoteness of the location made this seem unlikely. A few people, citing the strangeness of the vanishing, suggested something paranormal, pointing to other mysterious disappearances in national forests. Detective Blackwood dismissed the wild speculation and focused on the facts, but the facts led nowhere. Rebecca's family never gave up. They returned to the Bridger Teton every summer, hiking the trails, searching areas that had been searched before, hoping that something might have been missed. Robert Hartwell, growing older and frailer but no less determined, spent weeks at a time camped near his daughter's last known position, as if proximity might somehow bring her back. Janet Hartwell established a scholarship fund in Rebecca's name, supporting women pursuing degrees in field biology, creating something positive from the void of not knowing. Emma Hartwell became an advocate for wilderness safety, giving talks about the importance of emergency beacons and communication protocols, channeling her grief into action. The years passed with cruel indifference. 2019 became 2020, and the world turned its attention to a pandemic that made Rebecca's disappearance seem like a footnote in history. The Bridger Teton National Forest saw reduced visitor numbers during the pandemic years, the trails quieter, the wilderness reclaiming spaces that had been frequently traveled. By 2021, Rebecca Hartwell's case had been officially designated as cold. Detective Blackwood, who had worked it diligently for 3 years, retired from the sheriff's office, leaving the file to her successor with a note expressing her frustration and sorrow at having found no answers. The case was filed alongside dozens of others, people who had walked into the wilderness and never walked out, mysteries that the forest kept locked within its silent embrace. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that Rebecca Hartwell had not died in those first days after her disappearance. She had not fallen to her death or been killed by wildlife or succumbed to exposure. Instead, something far stranger had occurred, something that defied not just explanation, but the very boundaries of what seemed possible. Deep in the forest, miles from any established trail, stood an ancient Douglas fir tree, one of the giants that had survived fires and storms in the passage of centuries. This tree was more than 8 feet in diameter at its base, its bark thick and deeply furrowed, its crown reaching more than 150 feet into the sky. At some point in its long life, the tree had been struck by lightning, creating a massive vertical split that had partially healed but never fully closed. The interior of this split formed a hollow space, a narrow cavity that extended deep into the living wood of the tree, and it was within this cavity, in a state that fell somewhere between life and death, that Rebecca Hartwell existed. How she had come to be there, through what series of events, or by what mechanism, would remain forever unclear. But she was there, her body gradually being incorporated into the tree itself, her consciousness dimmed to almost nothing, her physical form sustained by processes that no biologist would have believed possible. On June 23, 2021, 3 forestry students from the University of Wyoming were conducting a survey of old-growth timber stands in a remote section of the Bridger Teton. The survey was part of a broader study on carbon sequestration in mature forests, requiring the students to locate, measure, and document particularly large or old specimens. The team consisted of James Kowalski, Maya Patel, and Lucas Chen, all in their early 20s, all experienced in backcountry navigation and field research. They had been working methodically through their assigned area for 4 days, camping in a different location each night, documenting dozens of impressive trees. On the morning of the 23rd, they hiked into a valley that was so remote and difficult to access that it likely saw human visitors only once every few years. The forest here was primordial, with trees that had been standing when the first European explorers entered the region. The students split up slightly to cover more ground, staying within calling distance of each other. Maya was working her way up a gentle slope when she came upon the Douglas fir. Its size was immediately apparent, the trunk so wide that 3 people linking hands might barely encircle it. She called out to James and Lucas, excited by the find, and they converged on the location. They began their standard documentation process, taking photographs, measuring the circumference with a tape, estimating the height using a clinometer. Lucas walked around the base of the tree, examining the bark, noting its characteristics. It was on the far side of the trunk that he noticed the split. The opening was perhaps 18 inches wide at its base, narrowing as it extended upward. Thick bark had grown around the edges, trying to seal the wound, but the interior was still exposed, showing the pale wood beneath. Lucas leaned closer, shining his flashlight into the gap, curious about how deep it went. What he saw in that beam of light made him recoil with a strangled shout. There was something inside the tree, something that looked horribly like a human form. Maya and James rushed over, demanding to know what was wrong. Lucas, his voice shaking, told them to look. Maya positioned her flashlight and peered into the opening. For a moment, her brain could not process what she was seeing. The cavity inside the tree extended back at least 3 feet, and within that space, partially encased in what appeared to be wood, was a figure. The form was vertical, pressed against the back of the hollow, as if standing. But calling it standing implied volition, awareness, and this thing had neither. It was skeletal thin, the skin a gray-brown color that was almost indistinguishable from the surrounding wood. The face was partially visible, tilted downward, the features distorted but unmistakably human. Long hair, matted and tangled with what might have been roots or fungal filaments, hung down over the shoulders. The arms were positioned at the sides, seeming to merge with the wood at the wrists and forearms. The clothing, if there had ever been clothing, was impossible to distinguish from the organic matter that surrounded the figure. Maya stepped back, her hand over her mouth, fighting nausea and shock. James pulled out his phone to call 911, then remembered they had no signal. He grabbed his GPS unit and marked the location, his hands fumbling with the device. Lucas simply stood staring, his mind trying and failing to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this a body? How long had it been here? How had it gotten inside the tree? The 3 students made a hasty decision. They needed to get to a location where they could communicate with authorities immediately. They took several photographs with their phones and cameras, documenting the tree and the location. Then they began the hike out, moving as fast as the terrain allowed, driven by adrenaline and horror. It took them 4 hours to reach a point where James's satellite phone could get a signal. He called 911, was transferred to the Teton County Sheriff's Office, and tried to explain what they had found. The dispatcher, hearing the story, initially thought it might be a prank or a misunderstanding. But the fear in James's voice was authentic, and the dispatcher followed protocol, recording the information and promising that someone would respond. By evening, the report had reached the desk of Detective Michael Torres, who had inherited Rebecca Hartwell's case, among others. When he read the description of the location, something made him pull up the old case file. He spread out the map showing Rebecca's last known positions and the areas that had been searched. The location the forestry students had reported was about 6 miles north of where the search had been concentrated, in an area that was considered unlikely because Rebecca's planned route did not extend that far. But 6 miles was not an impossible distance, and the description of human remains inside a tree, as bizarre as it sounded, demanded investigation. Detective Torres assembled a team by dawn of June 24th. The group included County Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Wells, 2 sheriff's deputies, a forensic photographer, and a forestry expert from the National Forest Service named Gerald Hutchins. The three students who had made the discovery were asked to guide them to the location, and though clearly traumatized by what they had seen, they agreed. The hike took most of the day. The students had not been exaggerating about the remoteness. The terrain was difficult, crossing streams, navigating around deadfall, climbing over rocky outcrops. By the time they reached the valley containing the massive Douglas fir, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. The team approached the tree with a mixture of professional detachment and deep unease. Gerald Hutchins examined the tree itself first, confirming that it was indeed ancient, possibly more than 400 years old, and that the split appeared to have been caused by a lightning strike decades earlier. Dr. Wells positioned herself at the opening in the trunk, shining a high-powered LED light into the cavity. She studied the figure inside for several long minutes before speaking. Her assessment was clinical, but edged with disbelief. The body, if it could be called that, appeared to be integrated with the tree. The wood had grown around it, through it in some places, as if the person had been absorbed over time. She could not determine from external examination whether this was a recent death or something that had occurred years ago. The state of preservation, if that was the right word, was unlike anything she had seen. The team documented everything exhaustively. Hundreds of photographs were taken from every angle. Video footage recorded the scene. Measurements were made of the tree, the opening, the cavity, the figure inside. As the light faded, they set up portable LED arrays, illuminating the site like a surgical theater in the wilderness. The question of how to extract the body was complex. Simply pulling it out was not possible. The figure appeared to be structurally part of the tree, the wood having grown into and around the tissues. Dr. Wells consulted with Gerald Hutchins about the best approach. They concluded that they would need to cut into the tree itself to carefully remove a section of wood that included the body. This would require specialized equipment and would have to wait until morning. The team spent an uncomfortable night camped near the site. No one slept well. The presence of the thing in the tree seemed to weigh on all of them, a wrongness that infected the peaceful forest around them. At first light, additional personnel arrived, having hiked in with chainsaws, cutting tools, and a portable stretcher designed for difficult extractions. Gerald Hutchins marked cut lines on the tree, planning to remove a vertical section that would include the entire cavity and its contents. The work was delicate and slow. The chainsaws bit into the ancient wood, sending the smell of fresh sawdust into the air. The sound was obscene in the quiet forest, a violence against the tree that had stood here for centuries. But it was necessary. After 3 hours of careful cutting, a section of the tree approximately 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide was ready to be removed. It weighed several hundred pounds. Ropes were positioned, and 6 people working together managed to lever it away from the main trunk. The section was lowered onto a tarp, the figure still inside, still part of the wood. Dr. Wells could now examine it more closely. With gloved hands, she carefully probed the exposed areas, trying to understand what she was seeing. The skin, where it was visible, had a texture that was papery and dry, but also strangely fibrous, as if plant matter had infiltrated the tissue. The hair was definitely matted with root-like structures. The face, now more clearly visible in full daylight, was distorted but retained enough structure for potential identification. She took tissue samples from several areas, cutting tiny pieces that she placed in sterile containers. She also noticed something else, the chest. It was moving. The movement was slight, perhaps one shallow rise and fall every 30 seconds, but it was present. Dr. Wells froze, staring, certain she must be mistaken. She placed her hand gently on the figure's chest and waited. There, a movement, faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. She looked up at Detective Torres, her face pale. She said 4 words that would haunt everyone present. This person is alive. The revelation that the figure in the tree was still living, in some capacity, transformed the situation from a recovery operation to a desperate medical emergency. Dr. Wells immediately checked for a pulse, pressing her fingers against the neck where the carotid artery should be. For a long moment, she felt nothing. Then the faintest flutter, a heartbeat so slow and weak it barely qualified as life. The rate was perhaps 4 or 5 beats per minute, impossibly slow, yet present. She checked the wrist, found the same barely there pulse. She leaned close to the face, feeling for breath. The exhalations were so slight, so infrequent, that they would have been undetectable without deliberate attention. The person, whoever they were, was alive in only the most technical sense, existing in a state that fell far outside normal human physiology. The team's priorities shifted instantly. This was no longer about carefully preserving an evidence. It was about getting this person to a hospital as quickly as possible. Though everyone present understood that separating them from the wood they were fused with would likely be fatal. An emergency medical helicopter was called, but the forest was too dense for it to land nearby. The closest clearing was more than 2 miles away, and carrying the massive section of wood containing the body would be nearly impossible. Dr. Wells made a difficult decision. They would need to remove some of the wood immediately, cutting away as much as possible while leaving intact anything that seemed to be structurally integrated with the body. It was surgery with chainsaws, performed in a forest, on a patient who should have been dead. Gerald Hutchins took charge of the cutting, using a smaller handsaw now for precision. He carved away wood from around the figure, working slowly, stopping whenever Dr. Wells indicated he was getting too close to tissue. The goal was to reduce weight while maintaining whatever strange integrity was keeping the person alive. As the excess wood fell away, the figure became more distinct. It was clearly female, the body proportions and remaining features making this apparent. She was incredibly thin, the bones visible through the papery skin. The integration with the wood was most extensive along the back, arms, and legs, as if she had been standing in the cavity and the tree had gradually grown around her. Her feet were completely encased, merged with the base of the hollow. Her hands were similarly absorbed into the sides. But her face, though distorted, remained somewhat separate. After 2 hours of painstaking work, they had reduced the wood section to a more manageable size. Though it still weighed well over 100 pounds, the figure was now visible enough for Dr. Wells to make a critical observation. On the left wrist, partially embedded in wood but still visible, was a watch. Not a modern smartwatch, but a durable field watch with a fabric strap. The watch face was cracked and the hands had stopped, but Dr. Wells could make out an engraving on the back. RH, follow your curiosity. She immediately radioed Detective Torres, who had been coordinating logistics a short distance away. When he arrived and saw the engraving, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the Rebecca Hartwell case file. There, in the inventory of Rebecca's personal effects and descriptions from family, was a notation about a watch her father had given her for her undergraduate graduation, engraved with those exact words. The possibility that had seemed too strange to consider suddenly became probable. The body in the tree might be Rebecca Hartwell. The realization added urgency to an already critical situation. A relay team was organized. 8 people would carry the wood section in shifts, moving as quickly as safety allowed toward the distant clearing. But Dr. Wells accompanied the body, monitoring the faint vital signs, though she had no equipment and no intervention she could provide. If the person inside the wood was going to survive, it would be because of whatever impossible process had kept them alive this long. The journey to the clearing took 4 hours. By the time they reached it, the sun was setting again, and the medical helicopter was circling above, looking for a safe approach. The wood section was loaded aboard with difficulty, secured as best as possible. Dr. Wells climbed in beside it, and the helicopter lifted off, racing towards St. John's Medical Center in Jackson. During the flight, Dr. Wells continued her observations. The skin temperature was far below normal, perhaps 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The respiration rate remained at roughly 2 breaths per minute. The heart rate had not increased despite the movement and transport. By all conventional medical understanding, the body should have been dead. The brain could not function without oxygen. The organs could not survive without circulation. Yet here this person was, demonstrating life signs, however minimal. At the hospital, a trauma team had been assembled and briefed on the unprecedented nature of the case. When the helicopter landed and the wood section was wheeled into the emergency department, the medical staff found themselves facing something no training had prepared them for. Dr. Rachel Kim, the trauma surgeon on duty, took one look at the patient and immediately understood that conventional interventions might do more harm than good. The body was in such a fragile, alien state that anything beyond the most minimal support could be fatal. While the medical team worked to stabilize the mysterious patient, Detective Torres contacted the Hartwell family. The conversation was among the most difficult of his career. He explained that remains had been found, that they might be Rebecca, that incredibly the person might still be alive, but that her condition was critical and incomprehensible. Robert and Janet Hartwell, along with Emma, drove through the night from Colorado, arriving at St. John's Medical Center in the early hours of June 25th. They were taken to a private consultation room where Dr. Kim explained what they were about to see. She warned them that the person in the ICU bore little resemblance to any normal human patient, that the sight would be disturbing, that they should prepare themselves for shock. Nothing could have truly prepared them. The woman lying in the hospital bed was connected to monitors that beeped softly, displaying vital signs that made no medical sense. Her body was emaciated beyond anything they had seen, covered in areas with what appeared to be bark-like growths. Her hair, matted with root structures, had been partially cut away to allow for examination. Her face was gaunt and distorted, the features asymmetrical. But Janet Hartwell took one look and knew. She knew from the shape of the ears, from a small scar on the chin that had been there since Rebecca was 7, from the bone structure that was still faintly recognizable beneath the ravages. She approached the bed slowly and took her daughter's hand, or what remained of it, partially wrapped in wood-like material. She spoke Rebecca's name softly, then louder, tears streaming down her face. There was no response. The woman in the bed gave no indication of awareness, her eyes closed, her breathing imperceptible. Robert Hartwell stood at the foot of the bed, gripping the rail, his face contorted with grief and disbelief. Emma stood beside her, one hand on Janet's shoulder, staring at this thing that might be her sister, trying to reconcile it with her memories. Formal identification required more than recognition. Dental records were obtained and compared by a forensic odontologist. Despite the degradation, enough tooth structure remained for a positive match. The woman in the ICU was definitively Rebecca Hartwell, missing for 2 years and 9 months, found in a condition that defied medical explanation. The news spread quickly. The story of a woman found alive inside a tree, years after vanishing, captured international attention. News crews descended on Jackson. The hospital was forced to station security to prevent unauthorized access. The Hartwell family, thrust into an unwanted spotlight, released a brief statement through the hospital administration, asking for privacy and prayers. The medical team faced unprecedented challenges. Rebecca's body was in a state of extreme metabolic slowdown, functioning at perhaps 5% of normal human activity. Her organs were viable, but barely. Her brain showed activity on EEG, but the patterns were unlike anything in medical literature. Slow oscillations that suggested consciousness was present, but profoundly suppressed. The integration with plant matter was extensive. Laboratory analysis of the bark-like growths revealed them to be actual plant tissue, apparently growing from Rebecca's body or into it. The root-like structures in her hair were fungal mycelia, similar to those found in forest soil, but somehow they had infiltrated without causing infection or death. It was as if Rebecca had become, in some sense, part of the forest ecosystem, her biology merging with the tree that had enclosed her. Dr. Kim consulted with specialists from around the world via video conference. Experts in hypothermia, in hibernation, in extreme survival cases examined the data and offered theories but no real explanations. Some suggested that Rebecca had entered a state similar to suspended animation, her metabolism slowing to near zero as an adaptation to starvation and extreme conditions. Others proposed that exposure to certain fungi or plant chemicals might have induced the state, essentially preserving her in a living stasis. But these were guesses, attempts to fit an impossible situation into some framework of understanding. The more immediate question was how, or even whether, to try to revive her. Bringing her metabolism back to normal levels carried enormous risks. Her organs might not withstand the transition. Her brain, having existed in such a profoundly altered state for years, might not resume normal function. But leaving her in this twilight state was not an option. She was not living in any meaningful sense. The hospital ethics committee met to discuss the case. The Hartwell family was consulted extensively. After agonizing deliberation, the decision was made to attempt a slow, carefully monitored revival, gradually increasing her body temperature, providing nutrition through IV, and supporting her organs as they resume function. It would be an experiment, a medical procedure with no precedent and no guarantee of success. The process of bringing Rebecca Hartwell back from her death-like state began on June 28th. Dr. Kim assembled a team that included specialists in intensive care, neurology, and metabolism. They started with the smallest possible interventions, raising the ambient temperature around Rebecca by 1 degree, increasing the concentration of nutrients in her IV by tiny increments, monitoring her vital signs continuously for any adverse reactions. The first 48 hours showed minimal change. Her heart rate remained around 4 to 5 beats per minute. Her breathing stayed shallow and infrequent. The medical team wondered if perhaps her body was locked in this state permanently, unable to return to normal function. But on the third day, they noticed a slight increase in her core temperature, from 80 degrees to 82. Her heart rate crept up to 6 beats per minute. Encouraged, they continued the gradual escalation of support. By the end of the first week, Rebecca's vital signs had improved to levels that were still far below normal, but approaching the threshold of viability. Her heart rate reached 20 beats per minute. Her breathing increased to once every 15 seconds. Her body temperature rose to 90 degrees. The monitors began to show patterns that looked more like life and less like the strange liminal state she had been in. Throughout this process, the Hartwell family maintained a constant vigil. They took turns sitting with Rebecca, talking to her, playing music she had loved, sharing memories and news from the years she had been gone. They told her about the world she had missed, about the pandemic, about her nephew born while she was lost, about the scholarship fund established in her name. They spoke as if she could hear him, though she gave no sign of awareness. On July 5th, 12 days after her revival began, Rebecca opened her eyes for the first time. A nurse named Kelly Brennan was adjusting her IV when she noticed the change. Rebecca's eyes were open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. Kelly immediately called for Dr. Kim, who rushed in with her neurology colleague, Dr. Sanjay Mehta. They examined Rebecca carefully, shining lights in her eyes, checking pupil response. The pupils constricted slightly to light, a basic reflex, but Rebecca's gaze did not track movement. She did not appear to focus on anything. Her eyes were open, but empty, looking at something beyond the physical world around her. Over the next few days, Rebecca exhibited more signs of emergence. Her eyes began to follow movement occasionally. Her fingers would flex and relax. Once she made a sound, a low moan that might have been an attempt at communication or simply an involuntary vocalization. Her family was both hopeful and terrified. Each small sign of recovery also highlighted how far Rebecca had to go, assuming she could recover at all. Dr. Mehta explained to the Hartwell family that Rebecca's brain had been in an extremely altered state for years. The pathways of normal consciousness might have degraded or been reconfigured. Even if she regained full physical function, her mental state might be permanently changed. She might not remember who she was. She might not be able to communicate. She might emerge from this ordeal as someone fundamentally different from the woman she had been. On July 10th, Rebecca spoke. Janet Hartwell was sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from a book of poetry Rebecca had loved, when she heard a whisper. She stopped reading and leaned close. Rebecca's lips were moving, forming a word. Janet asked her to repeat it. The word came again, barely audible. Tree. It was a beginning. Over the following days, Rebecca's vocabulary expanded painfully slowly. She said dark. She said roots. She said quiet. The words seemed to come from deep within her, pulled up from wherever her consciousness had been during her years in the wood. Physical therapy began as soon as Rebecca's condition stabilized enough to attempt movement. The plant growth on her body had begun to recede slightly, the bark-like areas softening and flaking away. The process was disturbing to watch, as if Rebecca was molting, shedding a skin that was not quite her own. Beneath, her natural skin was pale and thin, but gradually becoming more normal in texture. Her muscles, atrophied from disuse, required extensive rehabilitation. She could not sit up at first, could not support her own weight. Physical therapists worked with her multiple times daily, moving her limbs, helping her build strength incrementally. It was like teaching an infant, starting from absolute zero. By late July, Rebecca could sit with support. She could hold objects in her hands, though her grip was weak. She spoke in short sentences, though her thoughts remained fragmented and often centered on themes of darkness, wood, and silence. Psychiatrists worked with her daily, trying to understand her mental state, to help her process whatever trauma she had endured. As Rebecca slowly regained cognitive function, she began to remember pieces of what had happened to her, though the memories came in disjointed fragments that were difficult to assemble into a coherent narrative. In therapy sessions with Dr. Laura Dietrich, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma, Rebecca spoke haltingly about her experience. She remembered the day she disappeared. She had been hiking between her research sites following a game trail when she noticed something unusual, a massive Douglas fir with a split trunk that created an opening. As a botanist, she was fascinated by the tree's morphology and age. She approached to examine it more closely, to take photographs for her personal collection. She remembered looking into the split, seeing the cavity inside. She remembered thinking how remarkable it was that the tree had survived such significant damage. And then her memory fragmented. She recalled darkness. She recalled being unable to move. She recalled terror so profound it had no words. But the sequence of events, the mechanism of how she ended up inside the tree, remained elusive. Under careful questioning, more details emerged. She remembered her hands being bound. She remembered a voice, male, speaking to her from outside the tree. The words were unclear in her memory, but the tone was calm, almost gentle, explaining something she could not understand. She remembered struggling, trying to free herself, and then pain as something struck her head. After that, her memories became nonlinear and dreamlike. She recalled long periods of darkness where she was unsure if she was awake or asleep, alive or dead. She remembered the texture of wood against her skin, the smell of earth and sap. She remembered trying to scream but producing no sound, or perhaps screaming and hearing it absorbed by the wood around her. She remembered thirst, terrible thirst, and then discovering that moisture would occasionally seep through the wood, tiny amounts that she learned to lick from the surface near her face. She remembered hunger that eventually faded into numbness. She remembered cold that became her normal state, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply what existed. Most strangely, she remembered roots. She described feeling them growing into her, through her skin, into her tissues. She said it had not been painful, not exactly, but rather a pressure, a slow invasion that eventually felt almost natural. She said she had felt connected to the tree, aware of its slow life, its gradual growth, the passage of seasons marked by subtle changes in the wood around her. When Dr. Dietrich pressed gently for more concrete details, Rebecca became distressed. She said that after a while she had stopped trying to escape, stopped trying to stay human. She said she had let herself become part of the tree because it was easier than fighting. She said she had felt her thoughts slowing, spreading out like roots themselves, losing their distinct edges. She said she had forgotten words, forgotten her name, forgotten that she had ever been anything other than a silent part of the forest. The psychiatrist documented these accounts carefully, while noting that Rebecca's descriptions had a dreamlike, possibly confabulatory quality. It was unclear how much was actual memory and how much was the brain's attempt to construct a narrative from incomplete data. The human mind was not designed to remember years of sensory deprivation in extreme altered states. What Rebecca described might be metaphorical rather than literal, a way of processing an experience that had no frame of reference. Detective Torres interviewed Rebecca multiple times, trying to understand if a crime had been committed. The binding she mentioned suggested abduction, but by whom? Had someone deliberately placed her in the tree? If so, for what purpose? And how had the tree grown around her? Even the fastest growing trees added only inches per year. The integration Rebecca exhibited would have taken years to develop, which meant she had been alive inside the tree for most or all of the time she was missing. The investigation focused on the location where Rebecca had been found. Forensic teams combed the area around the Douglas fir, looking for evidence of human activity. They found very little. The forest floor had been disturbed over the years by weather and wildlife. Any footprints or tool marks had long since been erased. They did find, about 30 yards from the tree, the remains of Rebecca's backpack. It had been torn apart, possibly by animals, and much of its contents were scattered or destroyed. Her research equipment was missing. Her satellite phone was never recovered. They also found, much more disturbing, signs of a campsite approximately a quarter mile from the tree. The site was old, with faint traces of multiple fires, impressions in the ground where a tent might have stood, and bits of trash that suggested someone had stayed there for an extended period. Analysis dated the site to roughly the time of Rebecca's disappearance, possibly extending some weeks after. Detective Torres theorized that Rebecca had been abducted by someone living in this remote area. The perpetrator had kept her in the tree for reasons unknown, possibly checking on her periodically, perhaps intending to return but never doing so. Whether death or simply departure had prevented the abductor's return was unclear. A search of missing persons and criminal databases from that period yielded no strong suspects. The remoteness of the area meant that whoever had been there was comfortable in extreme wilderness, likely experienced in survival skills. But this description fit hundreds of people who frequented the backcountry. In August, nearly 2 months after her rescue, Rebecca's physical recovery had progressed enough that she could walk with assistance and speak in fuller sentences. Her mental state remained fragile, with frequent dissociations where she seemed to retreat back into the silent space she had occupied for so long. But during moments of clarity, she was present, recognizing her family, engaging with therapists, and slowly reclaiming pieces of her identity. It was during one of these clear moments that Rebecca told Dr. Dietrich something she had not mentioned before. She said that the man who had put her in the tree had told her his name. She said his name was Daniel, and that he had said he was teaching her about silence. Detective Torres was immediately notified. The name Daniel was not much to go on, but it was more than they had before. Rebecca worked with a sketch artist, trying to recreate the man's face from her fragmentary memories. The resulting sketch showed a man perhaps in his 40s, with weathered features, long hair, and intense eyes. The sketch was distributed to law enforcement agencies and media outlets across Wyoming and neighboring states. Within days, a former park ranger named Martin Kellerman contacted the Teton County Sheriff's Office. He said the sketch resembled someone he had encountered years ago, a man named Daniel Kovach, who had worked briefly as a wilderness guide before disappearing into the backcountry himself around 2017. Kellerman said Kovach had been odd, speaking frequently about the need for humans to reconnect with nature on a fundamental level, to shed the noise of modern life and find truth in isolation. Kellerman had assumed Kovach was just another wanderer drawn to the wilderness, but the intensity of his beliefs had been unsettling. Records showed that Daniel Kovach was a former philosophy professor who had left academic life and progressively withdrawn from society. His last known address was in Montana, abandoned in 2016. He had no criminal record, but associates described him as increasingly eccentric and obsessed with concepts of isolation and transcendence. With a name and a face, the search intensified. Backcountry rangers and frequent wilderness users were shown Kovach's photograph and asked if they had seen him. Several people reported encounters with a man matching his description in various remote areas over the years, always alone, always avoiding extended conversation. But no one had seen him recently. In September 2021, a group of hunters in the Absaroka Range, northeast of where Rebecca had been found, discovered a small, well-hidden campsite in a cave. Inside were personal belongings, including a journal filled with handwriting. The journal was brought to authorities and compared with known samples of Daniel Kovach's writing. It was a match. The journal entries painted a disturbing picture. Kovach had been living in the wilderness for years, moving seasonally between different locations, surviving on foraged food and small game. His writings reflected a deepening obsession with the idea that modern humans had lost their essential nature, that they needed to be stripped of comfort and noise to rediscover their true selves. In entries dated September 2018, Kovach wrote about encountering a woman of science who was studying trees but did not understand them. He described following her, watching her work, deciding that she was suitable for the teaching. Subsequent entries detailed his abduction of Rebecca, describing it in clinical, detached language. He had struck her unconscious, bound her, and placed her in the tree cavity that he had discovered months earlier. He described it as a womb of wood where she could be reborn in silence. His plan, as articulated in the journal, was to keep her there for an unspecified period, providing minimal water but no food, forcing her body to slow down, to adapt, to become as the trees become. He wrote that he visited her regularly at first, speaking to her about his philosophy even though she was too weak to respond. He wrote that he observed her transformation with satisfaction, believing that she was achieving a state of consciousness he called the quiet mind. But later entries showed that Kovacs himself had been deteriorating. His writing became more erratic, less coherent. He described hearing voices in the wind, seeing patterns in the forest that revealed cosmic truths. He wrote about pain in his chest, difficulty breathing, weakness in his limbs. The final entry, dated November 2018, just 2 months after Rebecca's abduction, was barely legible. The forest teaches me now, I will learn the final lesson. Kovacs' body was found 3 weeks after the discovery of the journal. Less than a mile from the cave campsite, he had apparently died of a heart attack, his remains scattered by scavengers over the years, but still identifiable through dental records and DNA. He had died within weeks of his last journal entry, which explained why Rebecca's imprisonment had become permanent. Kovacs had planned to continue his teaching, but death had ended his visits, leaving Rebecca trapped in the tree with no way to free herself. The confirmation that Daniel Kovacs was dead and that Rebecca had been the victim of a delusional abductor brought a form of closure to the criminal investigation. But it did nothing to erase the trauma or the strangeness of what had happened. Rebecca had spent nearly 3 years in a state that fell between life and death, her body and mind altered in ways that medical science could not fully explain or reverse. By October 2021, Rebecca had recovered enough to leave the hospital. She moved into her parents' home in Colorado, where she continued intensive physical and psychological therapy. Her body slowly returned to normal, the last traces of plant integration finally sloughing away. She regained weight and strength. Her hair grew back. Physically, except for some scarring and reduced function in her hands, where the wood had been most deeply embedded, she appeared to have recovered. Mentally, the recovery was more complicated. Rebecca struggled with the modern world. Bright lights bothered her. Noise overwhelmed her. She preferred to spend time in quiet spaces, often in the garden, where she would sit for hours among the plants. She said that normal conversation felt too fast, that words moved at a pace she could no longer match. She said that sometimes she missed the silence of the tree, a confession that disturbed her therapists, but which she insisted was true. Dr. Dietrich worked with Rebecca on reintegration, helping her process the trauma, helping her understand that her feelings were valid responses to an unprecedented experience. They worked on distinguishing between the Rebecca who had existed before the abduction and the Rebecca who had emerged from the tree, recognizing that she would never be exactly the same person, but that she could build a new identity that incorporated both. In early 2022, Rebecca expressed a desire to visit the Douglas fir, the tree that had been her prison and, in some strange way, her savior. Her family was hesitant, her therapist cautious, but Rebecca was insistent. She said she needed to see it, to understand it, to make peace with it. In April 2022, nearly a year after her rescue, Rebecca returned to the Bridger-Teton National Forest. A small group accompanied her: her parents, her sister, Detective Torres, and Dr. Dietrich. They hiked into the remote valley where the ancient tree stood. The tree had healed somewhat from the section that had been removed. New bark had begun to form over the wound. The forest around it was vibrant with spring growth, birds calling, new leaves unfurling. Rebecca approached the tree slowly. She placed her hands on the bark, feeling its texture. She pressed her forehead against it and stood there for a long time, silent. When she finally stepped back, tears were streaming down her face. She said, her voice barely audible, "Thank you." Her family did not understand, and perhaps she could not fully explain. But in that moment, Rebecca was not thanking the tree for imprisoning her, but for keeping her alive, for sharing its slow, patient existence with her when she had nothing else. She was acknowledging a connection that had been forged in darkness and silence, one that would remain with her forever. In the years that followed, Rebecca slowly rebuilt her life. She did not return to academic botany, finding that the structured, analytical approach to plants no longer resonated with her. Instead, she became a naturalist, leading quiet walks in forests, teaching people to slow down and observe, to listen to the silence beneath the noise. She spoke publicly about her experience only rarely, but when she did, she emphasized the resilience of the human body and spirit, the strange ways that life persists even in impossible conditions. She also spoke about the danger of isolation, the darkness that can grow in minds untethered from community and reason. Daniel Kovacs had lost himself in his own philosophy, had become so disconnected from humanity that he could no longer recognize the harm he was causing. Rebecca said that her survival was not just physical, but relational, that even in her deepest isolation, the memory of connection, of family, of love, had kept some part of her human. The scientific community remained fascinated by her case. Research papers were published examining the physiological changes she had undergone, the apparent symbiosis between her body and the tree, the extreme metabolic slowdown that had preserved her. No full explanation was ever reached. Rebecca's survival remained at the edges of what was medically understood, a reminder that life was more adaptable, more tenacious, and stranger than even our best science could account for. Rebecca Hartwell lived the rest of her life differently than she had planned, but she lived. She had been taken from the world and returned from a place no one should have survived. She carried the forest inside her, in memories of silence and slow growth, in an understanding of patience that only the trees possess. And in her own way, she had become a bridge between two worlds. The human world of noise and speed and complexity, and the older world of root and wood and the deep, abiding quiet of the earth itself.